Welcome to the Hinckley Institute of Politics. My name is Katie, and I'll be the host for today's Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute was established in 1965 through the generous bequest of the Noble Foundation and Robert H. Hinckley. The Institute is dedicated to teaching students respect for practical politics and the principle of citizen involvement in government. The Hinckley Institute offers paid internships to students of all majors here locally, in Washington, D.C., and in 55 countries around the globe. The Hinckley Institute also offers classes, the nation's only campaign management minor, week-long experiences to D.C., and more than $300,000 in academic scholarships. We invite students to go next door or to www.hinckley.utah.edu for more information. The title of today's forum is Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, the Global Movement Against Israeli Settler Colonialism and Apartheid, and is presented by the Tanner Center for Human Rights and Peace Advocacy Coalition. Our guest speaker is Susan Abulhawa. She is a Palestinian-American writer, human rights activist, and founder of non-governmental organization Playgrounds for Palestine. She is the author of international best-selling novel Mornings in Jenin. Her latest novel, The Blue Between Sky and Water, was released in the U.S. on September 1st, 2015, and has already been translated into 19 languages. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Susan Abulhawa.
Hello. Just a very slight correction. I'm actually going to be talking about dominant narratives rather than about specifically BDS. So I'm really delighted to see a full house. Thank you all for being here today. And I hope it wasn't just for the pizza. I want to thank the Hinckley Institute for hosting my talk and the Peace Advocacy Coalition for inviting me here and arranging my trip. In very broad terms, I want to talk about global challenges in the context of narrative, of how we perceive and contextualize global issues. So that we can begin to see how the narrative that we have in turn shapes these very same issues around the world. And these include, for example, the carnage that's raging across the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Palestine, about ISIS, about the plundering of our planet and the destruction of non-human life. Some of what I'm going to talk about was actually written for a venue in the UK. It was for a literature festival. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the Hay Festival. And that portion of my talk here encompasses a short survey of relatively well-documented actions of the Western world around the planet. My talk initially was rejected for being too uncomfortable for a Western audience. And because I refused to alter the content, I ended up not presenting for that particular program. And during that same gathering, I attended a talk by Jon Snow, whom many of you probably already know is a relatively well-known BBC broadcaster. Snow spoke about current events in the Middle East. Now, the audience at this annual gathering was, it's considered a relatively well-informed, educated portion of the literary establishment in the UK. And nearly all of the questions from this audience revolved around perceived threats from Arabs and from Muslims around the world. There was a general tone of bewilderment and curiosity about these otherized human beings who seemed so frightening in their savagery, so frightening in their desperate need for escape from raging wars. I raised my hand during this talk, but we had run out of time, and I didn't get to speak. But what I wanted to express, and what I'm going to go into a bit more here, is that from my vantage point, and from the vantage point of the vast majority of humanity, it has been the West, principally the United States, Israel, and some of their European allies, who have posed the greatest threat to humanity, to freedom, to non-human life, and to the environment. There was a tremendous distance between my thoughts and theirs, and I was left contemplating that chasm in perception and thought. How was it that no one in the audience could see the horrors and the inferno that the West had brought to the Middle East? How no one questioned how or why these situations came to be? And so in the imagination of this Western narrative, violence elsewhere springs from something vexing, something that's culturally inherent. My experience at this conference reinforced a few things that I had been thinking about for a while. No matter how enlightened they claim to be, are mostly unwilling to hear voices that indict their own narrative of the world. But what's more important is that their narratives of the world are often shaped by powers beyond themselves. But they're narratives that they adopt nonetheless, based on notions of shared identity, including the nation-state identity. So in other words, when I tried to speak about the West, about Western actions, ordinary citizens in the West, like the producers who rejected my talk, absorb what follows those words in a very personal way, even though it was clear from the context of what I had written that I was talking about the actions of Western democracies, of Western governments. But part of this has to do with the fact that citizens of Western democracies do not see a real separation between themselves and between their governments. The inherent belief in a democracy is that the government is truly representative of the people. Another pillar of belief that's inherent in democratic societies is that our press is an unconstrained force that's motivated by truth and truth alone. And of course, neither of these assumptions hold up under any meaningful scrutiny. And one thing that's true about societies that live under autocratic regimes is that they see themselves as very separate from their governments, which I think is one reason why they continue to welcome US or European citizens, despite the great offenses that are committed against them by Western governments. So the challenge I had in writing this talk had to do with the use of pronouns. As a US citizen, as a resident, and a taxpayer, I felt I should use the words we, us, and our when describing Western actions. But also as an Arab, as a Palestinian, as a woman, as a Muslim, I'm also the other. But I thought I still couldn't use words like you, because as far as I know, you are not the ruling elite, nor the upper political echelons that orchestrate and shape our world. So I've tried to stick to saying the West or the US as much as possible, but it's quite tricky, and I hope you'll forgive the pitfalls. Every generation in this country has been subjected to various narratives about different enemies that the US must destroy for its survival. There were the savage Indians who could not be civilized into accepting the edicts of manifest destiny, who had to be liquidated, removed, tricked, marched away. There were the inferior black humans, impertinent enough not to accept their status, impertinent enough to demand justice, who needed to be kept in their place, lest they destroy the prevailing way of life, the way God intended it to be. There were the godless communists taking over the world, who had to be confronted and stopped, even if it meant burning to the ground every sympathetic nation. And we did that to a large extent. There were the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the Cubans, the socialists, the Marxists, the terrorists, the Arabs, the Muslims. We have attacked them all, brought unspeakable carnage to them under banners of lofty ideals and moral authority. There are few places on this planet that have been spared Western military dominance. And in the popular narratives, the violence we wage is always somehow necessary. It's justified violence. It's ironic violence, moral violence, even romantic violence. Others are always inferior, backward, uncivilized, savage, stupid, subhuman, monstrous. Their violence is terrorism. It's abhorrent and it's barbaric. That is the ingrained narrative that we resurrect and recycle over and over, bestowing new names and places in new times. And while this may be the timeless formula for war, social and spiritual evolution and advancement requires introspection. Self-examination, as the strongest nation on earth, for now anyway, is a requisite to understanding why we find ourselves in such a chaotic, violent, and polluted planet. True introspection demands that we relinquish the thing that binds us all, no matter where we find ourselves in the American political spectrum. And it is the belief that we are the good guys on this planet. A belief that's underpinned by a sense that there is no separation between us, citizens of nations, and our governments. Because we see ourselves individually as good, the belief is that collectively, as a governed nation, that though we may err, our actions toward others are spurred by moral pangs and guided by the compass of inclusion and democracy. I believe this is the profound lie that James Baldwin spoke of when he said, "All Western nations are caught in a lie of their pretend humanism." This means that their history has no moral justification and the West has no moral authority, unquote. To arrive at an understanding of the world we fear, it is imperative to examine how the West has helped to shape the world. To face the reality that the West has laid waste to cities across continents, terrorized and traumatized whole societies, and plundered our planet as none others have. In exploring that statement by James Baldwin, I want to present a brief survey of its underpinnings, just a small fraction, and only insofar as our lifetimes reach, just as a small attempt to poke holes in the narrative upon which we stand and accuse. Our lifetimes alone witness black bodies hanging from trees, where entire white families would come out by the thousands to watch and cheer the spectacle of lynchings. I was born toward the end of our foray into Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The wholesale rape and wanton slaughter of innocents and extraordinary destruction of the natural world, the consequences of which continue to plague Earth and humanity to this day. In 1944, the United States and Britain divvied up Middle Eastern oil. President Roosevelt said to the British ambassador, quote, "Persian oil is yours. We share the oil of Iraq and Kuwait. As for Saudi Arabian oil, it's ours." unquote. This sense of entitlement to the resources of others is what has driven all Western relationships with other nations, predominantly those populated by Black and brown populations. The ethos of Western dominance and empire has spurred relentless so-called interventions throughout the world, including the removal or assassination of leaders, the installation of client regimes, the suppression of nationalist struggles, the propagation of internecine fighting, and the manipulation of nations with threats, with aid and duplicity. Former colonial misadventures were merely replaced with neo-colonial fomenting of chaos to facilitate further looting. Post-colonial nations, or so-called post-colonial nations, were never allowed to heal or develop their societies. The endless overt and covert Western violence gave them no peace, no respite or stability long enough to have their own social movements for women's rights, for animal rights, for gay rights, nor to have their own scientific, cultural, sexual, or economic revolutions. In particular, any time a people would attempt to liberate themselves, to elect a nationalist leader committed to the welfare of his or her people, the West, usually the CIA, would kill, depose, and replace them with puppet autocrats who rained terror on their people for Western patronage. Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation north of the Ivory Coast, advocated for autonomy and self-sufficiency. He implemented one of Africa's most ambitious and successful economic and social reforms. He prioritized agrarian self-sufficiency. He instituted a nationwide literacy and education campaign, public health and vaccination systems. He planted over 10 million trees to combat desertification that was left in the wake of exploitive corporations. He ended the corruption of feudal landlords and established roads and rail systems. He was committed to women's rights and outlawed traditional patriarchal practices like genital mutilation, forced marriage, and polygamy. And fearing such empowerment, social empowerment, would set an example for neighboring African nations, the West conspired to assassinate Sankara, reversing all of his progressive policies and plunging his people once again into dependency on and exploitation by the West, from which they have yet to recover. Likewise, Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected president of an independent Republic of Congo, following decades of Belgium's private Holocaust that left over 10 million Congolese murdered for the benefit of King Leopold's personal wealth. Lumumba was the first and best hope that the Congolese had of emerging from their tortured past. Then, after we murdered him, we sent our corporations, our miners, our militias, and missionaries to oversee the bloodletting of 7 million more Congolese. They have never recovered from that assault, which was actually still sustained through the arming of various militias to ensure access to vital minerals necessary for Western technology. Just as in Africa, the United States has likewise terrorized any South American nation that sought to emerge from under the shadow and tyranny of our corporations and the appointed local lords. El Salvador, we funneled over $6 billion in the 1980s to crush a people's movement that sought to bring social justice. We dispatched death squads that were trained in the notorious School of the Americas, in torture, abduction, and killing, to squash any aspirations for democracy or economic inclusion. In Guatemala, in 1954, because their elected leader, Jacobo Arbenz, dared to implement land reform policies, buying unused land from the American United Fruit Company. The CIA, at the urgings of U.S. corporations, implemented an aggressive propaganda campaign and a coup to oust Arbenz, unleashing at least 4 decades of terrible bloodshed, instability, civil war, and environmental destructions. They, too, have never really recovered. In the 1980s, the CIA used Honduras as a staging ground to unseat the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. We supplied hundreds of millions of dollars to mercenary battalions to crush leftist social justice movements in Honduras. And in neighboring Nicaragua, the U.S. brought misery to its citizens for nearly a decade by arming, financing, and training anti-government Contra rebels. The crime of the Sandinistas, again, was instituting social programs to increase literacy and nationalization of projects to redistribute wealth by turning abandoned or unused land into peasant cooperatives. Likewise, in Chile, the people elected a left-leaning socialist leader, Salvador Allende, who was committed to the advancement of his people. Allende nationalized major industries, especially copper mines. He embarked on a campaign to strengthen education and health care. He instituted a program of free milk for children. In his first year in office, Salvador Allende's government improved the economy. They reduced unemployment and inflation. They increased wages and salaries. They reduced taxes. He created a system that provided the most desperate citizens with basic items and increased pensions for the elderly, for widows and orphans. It was an extraordinary transformation in a short period of time. In response, the U.S. launched a coup, and when it failed, Nixon ordered the CIA to, quote, make their economy scream. And that's what we did. What followed was a series of U.S.-backed terrorism, sabotage, arson, abductions, and bombings, and ultimately the assassination of Salvador Allende. Chile was thus plunged into torture and misery under the command of our guy, Augusto Pinochet. Of course, we tried repeatedly to kill Fidel Castro. We tried repeatedly, and maybe ultimately succeeded in killing Hugo Chavez, and maybe Yasser Arafat too. In the Middle East, the U.S. began overthrowing elected leaders nearly as soon as nations gained their independence from colonial powers. The first of these was actually in Syria in 1949. A CIA-backed coup then installed Colonel Hosni Zaim, whose first order of business when he took office was to approve a previously blocked U.S. oil pipeline project through Syrian territory from Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean. The removal of Syria's first democratically elected president, Shukri al-Qawatli, who advocated for Arab unity and true self-determination, shattered that fledgling democracy in ways that still reverberates into the unbearable carnage that is Syria today. When Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected leader of Iran, nationalized his country's oil, deciding that Iranian oil was for the Iranian people and not the British, the United States and Britain engineered a coup in 1953 to oust and replace him with the Shah, whose tyranny over his people lasted for 25 years. And in the end, it was the U.S. again that turned against him and empowered the Ayatollah Khomeini. This is very not well-known facts of history, by the way, because the Shah at that time, towards the end of his tenure, he dared to institute policies with regard to oil that were more favorable to his people than to the West. And the way that the Iranian Revolution transpired, which was not what the U.S. expected, is considered a prime example of what the CIA calls blowback, or unintended consequences of our meddling. And likewise, when a popular uprising in Iraq replaced the puppet monarchy with a nationalist government in 1958, headed by Abdul Karim Qasim. The response of the West was not to encourage this move towards self-determination in Iraq. Instead, the U.S. instigated a coup that would allow the Ba'ath Party to consolidate power, to kill the backbone of Iraqi society, including a long list that was thousands of names compiled by the CIA of intellectuals, progressives, nationalists, doctors, scientists, and teachers, and ultimately bring Saddam Hussein to power, who would brutalize his people with the blessing of the United States, and who would attack Iran also with the blessing, and many would say encouragement, of the United States. The U.S. armed Iraq first, and then turned around and gave support and arms to Iran to ensure that neither gained the upper hand, and the inhumanity and the killing would continue as long as possible. Some of you may recall that what became known as the Iran-Contra affair. The CIA had tied sale of arms to Iran with the arming of the Contras in Nicaragua, because it was illegal at that point to arm the Contras. So this was kind of a workaround that Reagan and Oliver North, some of you are old enough to remember that scandal. The U.S. then switched sides, again, arming Saddam once more. They gave him the chemical weapons that were used to kill tens of thousands of Kurds and Iranians, and which would later be used as a pretext, called WMDs, to attack Iraq in the Second Gulf War. Over 1 million people were killed in the Iran-Iraq War, and far more than that perished in both Gulf Wars that were spaced out with 10 years of barbaric sanctions. The U.S. intervention in Iraq did not just target military installations, but the infrastructure of life, including roadways, nearly all electrical plants, sewage treatment, and water installations, such that Iraqi society continued to die of rampant disease and malnutrition and depleted uranium long after falling bombs stopped killing them. An estimated 560,000 children, just under the age of 5, died as a result of sanctions alone. And in an incomprehensible arrogance of the West that the rest of the world has come to know well, Madeleine Albright said that the death of those small lives was, quote, worth it. The ones that survived Western barbarity are the rank and file of ISIS now. They are the ones who grew up surrounded by death, without education because we bombed their schools, their roads, their bridges. The ones who drank the awful water that we polluted when the Clintons systematically destroyed their water system. The ones who nursed on the depleted uranium that we spread throughout their land. They grew up facing U.S. soldiers and private interrogators and mercenaries, whose merciless cruelty is still being hid from view. What we saw of Abu Ghraib, we know, was just the tip of the iceberg. I submit to you that the West made ISIS. ISIS is our Frankenstein, not Islam's. They are monsters that we unleashed into their tortured cities, into societies that were too broken to perform the normal social functions of marginalizing extreme elements. We still do not know how ISIS is so well trained and so well armed, but there are credible reports indicating Western and Israeli backing and arming. We destroyed Iraq. We reduced that ancient society, that birthplace of agriculture, written language, and mathematics, into a cauldron of internecine violence. As U.S. corporations and capitalists looted their museums and oil fields and continue to do so, it will be generations before they might recover. All throughout the Middle East, and indeed around the world, we have made beggars of mothers, teachers, and doctors, and produced generations of illiterates into what had been high-functioning, cultured societies. We were reminded of Madeleine Albright's arrogance years later when Hillary Clinton, in describing the devastation of Libya and murder of Gaddafi, when she said, smiling in an interview, quote, "We came, we saw, he died," unquote. In fact, under Gaddafi, Libya had free education, a literacy rate that climbed from 10% when he took power to 87%. They had a high life expectancy, a low infant mortality rate, free electricity for everyone, free health care, affordable housing for all, free higher education. And now, the rampant insecurity, the ongoing killing, the executions, the tribal infighting in Libya gives a lie to the notion that the West intervened to prevent slaughter and bring democracy. The US had wanted Gaddafi gone for a long time. They tried to assassinate him in 1986, but instead killed his daughter along with 200 others. Libya is now a NATO outpost, plagued with rampant corporate looting and tribal feuding, deteriorating basic services and deteriorating civil infrastructure, which had been, by the way, among the best in Africa. Likewise, Afghanistan had been on a path to democracy, to women's rights, modernization, and development when the US began arming the Mujahideen in the 1970s, later known as the Taliban. Osama bin Laden was our guy, and we know the miserable state of that country now. Afghanistan, too, has never recovered and will not likely do so for many decades to come. I could really go on and on. Haiti, Grenada, Indonesia, Pakistan, and so many more countries. And of course, what we have done in Palestine. The West remains the principal and only supporter of a still ongoing ethnic cleansing campaign to erase Palestine, as if the last few thousand years never happened. We embrace a political movement that was born in Europe, supposedly under the auspices of none other than God, that proceeded to rape, to pillage, murder, and steal home and heritage of the indigenous population in a long-standing project to destroy our ancient society and replace it with a more worthy one from Europe, from the US, and from other parts of the world. Ostensibly a population chosen by God. That once multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic land is now a place of exclusivity, a place of supremacy and entitlement for Jews at the terrible expense of the non-Jewish natives. It's a place of apartheid, of multi-tiered laws based on religion, of color-coded IDs, color-coded license plates, segregated roads and buses, of military occupation, guard towers, snipers, sweeping surveillance, systematic state theft, constant displacement, constant harassment. Palestine is the place of my ancient lineage, centuries of inhabiting a village in East Jerusalem called Tur, and before that, centuries more in a West Jerusalem village called Deir el-Hawa, from whence my surname derives. But none of us is allowed to live there or inherit our birthright. We are exiled, occupied, or languishing in refugee camps so that every Jewish person in the world can have an extra country and dual citizenship. The devastation that the West has wrought on others is truly breathtaking. When refugees of the infernos stoked by the West managed to escape, grasping at the wind for some lifeline, they let them get swallowed by the sea. Or, if they let them in, the West congratulates itself endlessly for its charity and simultaneously bemoans the immigrant crisis, as if they had no hand in the creation of the desperation in the first place. I was really heartened recently to see the reception from ordinary citizens in Europe, which actually, it was their their insistence that pressured a change in governmental policy, again underscoring the separation for me between people and the ruling elite. Then, when we had destroyed, stripped, and raped so many of everything in this world, and they had nothing left but their faith to give them a minimum of solace, Western cartoonists openly and publicly mocked what is sacred and holy to them, ascribed the most vile filth to their prophet, and in characteristic arrogance called it free speech. But we do not see the arrogance. We don't see the irony, nor the enormous cruelty. We see it as enlightenment, as freedom. We are enlightened, free to think and free to express. Their rage is something primitive, inherent to their religion. Western narratives do not make connections with the fact that desperate and hungry people are at their shores because Western bombs and Western conniving and scheming is what devastated and destabilized whole nations and whole regions from which they come. This narrative sees no connection between the destruction of nations and the emergence of ghoulish fanatics who settle in the power vacuums we create. Western narratives have no sense of history, not of other nations, not even of their own. France bemoans the presence of Algerians in their midst, endlessly complain of their burden, as if France had not occupied, plundered, and terrorized Algeria for over a century. In the US, we speak of social justice movements and uprisings as riots perpetrated by thugs and lazy people who want handouts, as if this country were not built by the sweat, tears, and yet untold misery of their ancestors, as if Black citizens have not faced nor continue to face systematic and institutional disenfranchisement and marginalization. We speak of Iraqis fighting foreign troops in their own country as terrorists, insisting that we are the good bringers of freedom. James Baldwin was right, that Western nations are caught in a lie of pretend humanism. In the myth that we are the ultimate good guys trying to save the rest of the world. In the lie that our wealth is gained from our unique ingenuity and hard work, rather than the exploitation and plunder of other nations and other peoples. The lie that a democracy means that our government acts in the interest of the common man and woman, rather than the interests of those who cannot have enough, who would see their fortunes amass beyond need, beyond reason, beyond comprehension. The lie that our press is loyal to the truth, rather than corporate, private, or political interests. Most Americans know little to nothing of these historic events, or how our actions across continents have shaped present political and social realities in various regions. One can say it's willful ignorance, but I think it's something else that starts from basic narratives, ones that we have about ourselves as a national collective, that we, the totality of the West, or at least the Christian white West, are mostly the good guys in a dichotomous world of good and bad. Assumptions about the people we elect, that their actions are motivated by the public good rather than self-interest, the attainment of corporate favor, of power and prestige. And of course, the assumptions that profound differences in morality are delineated by land borders rather than human factors. I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons that people in other parts of the world continue to more or less distinguish Western citizens from the actions of their government has to do with, in part, the fact that they see themselves as very separate from their government. Another factor is that Western culture, in particular American culture, is known and accessible. They see our films, they read our books, they follow our celebrities. They laugh at our comedies and they cry at our dramas. They watch our elections and they know our internal struggles. They take sides in the Black Lives Matter movement. They take sides in national legal battles like the Trayvon Martin case. Very few Americans recognize their humanity in the way that they see ours. We don't watch Egyptian films, and we don't read novels from Pakistan or Indonesia. And I'm not saying that you have to do that. What I am saying is that we are limited, extremely limited, by the simple narratives that we utilize to explain the rest of the world. And that narrative is one of the primary things that allows those in power to do what they want with the rest of the world, which in turn helps to shape the threats and the challenges that we perceive. What I am saying is that we're not necessarily the good guys, that the world is not dichotomous anyway. I'm saying that we have much to do with global suffering, that the basic premise of the popular narrative is a lie. Thank you.
We will devote the remainder of the time to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please speak directly into the microphone, state your name, and give a little bit of information about yourself.
Hi, my name's Sean Ranson. I'm an undergraduate here at the University of Utah in political science. Trying to put this question together in a way that makes sense. I really didn't take time on it because it's an idea right now. In the talk, we talked about different regions of the world and where Western intervention created more autocratic governments in the face of native democratic movements, native self-determinist movements. You also, in the talk, talked about the benefits of the Gaddafi government to the Libyan people. So ultimately, do you feel that what's necessary is self-determination for these regions of the world that we've thrust into chaos, or is it more important that they also have a direct channel to democracy?
So I believe what's most important is that people forge their own paths. Gaddafi was a tyrant, there's no doubt about it, and you can say awful things about him and you'd be absolutely correct. But the things I said are also correct of what he brought to Libya. Libya was a post-colonial nation, barely a couple of generations from Italian colonization. Nations have a right to undergo their own evolution, their own transformations. We have been a nation for a couple hundred years, and we didn't start out the way in the place that we are now. We didn't start out with women having the right to vote, or even people of color having the right to vote. We underwent a lot of movements and a lot of revolutions. And we were able to do that because of the political stability that's afforded by being masters of our own fate and not having other nations constantly come in and trying to fix us or tell us what we should do. Other nations have that right. And, Libya being a few decades out from having its independence for just a few decades, and having achieved what they did, even under a tyrant, was remarkable. And they should have been left alone because they have a right to forge their own destiny. I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Hello, right here.
Yeah.
I'm JR. I'm a psychologist by diploma. And as I was listening to your speech, I just picture you speaking directly to Donald Trump. I was laughing here by myself. I'm thankful for your time to come here and share your knowledge. My quick question is, how do you skip or ignore retaliation?
What do you mean? Retaliation in what context?
Being a knowledgeable woman, speaking about all that you just demonstrated.
You mean retaliation by Native peoples?
Yes, yes.
I think a lot of people have skipped retaliation. We dropped nuclear bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We terrorized we terrorized the whole of South America, and likewise the Middle East and Africa. Most people want to live their lives, and they go on, even despite feeling this tremendous sense of injustice. But most people who are powerless go on with their lives. Yes, there's some people who do attempt to balance the power, and that's a direct consequence of the persistent and perpetual thwarting of other people's desires to be masters of their own fate.
My name is Kim, and I'm an undergraduate student of history and political science. And my question is, do you think that democracy is always going to be the outcome of people's movements around the world? I mean, with Western intervention, it always is, or always is supposed to be. But do you think that really
never is with Western interventions, but go ahead.
It's always meant to be, but never is. Do you think that is always the outcome that would be ideal, or do you think that in some cases it's, I mean, from a Western perspective, we tend to place democracy as the pinnacle of everything. But do you think that's always true?
Just a quick sort of qualification. I don't think that democracy has really ever been the intended outcome of our interventions. There's not a single instance that I can think of, actually, where that was the intended consequence. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. I think people have a right. Democracy is, I mean, we haven't reached the end of history with democracy. It is not necessarily the pinnacle achievement of political constructs. I think people are creative and imaginative, and every nation has a right to find its way. But I think, to me, always the desired outcome or the hope of people's movements is liberty, and social, like a stable social construct that allows people to pursue meaningful lives without domestic and international threats on their safety, on their liberties, and so forth. And I think too, we always think in terms of human life, and I think the lives and well-being of non-human life and the well-being of our planet really is something that has to factor into these things, which is actually antithetical to capitalism in general. Democracy and capitalism are not synonymous. I'll say that, but.
Hi, my name is Muna. First of all, thank you so much for being here. It really is an honor. As a Palestinian American, I really connect deeply with your work. I bought Mornings in Jenin on my first trip to Palestine, and it was the most emotional and spiritual experience of my life. I actually on the flight back, 3 out of 5 hours was spent in tears and anger and frustration, just thinking about this, and because it's just a story it's universal for any indigenous person who's gone through apartheid, oppression, any of that. So growing up in Salt Lake, no one really knows what Palestine is, let alone where it is. So, and with any of these experiences or any of these situations that you were talking about, no one really gets it. I'm always constantly finding myself giving a 2-minute spiel about what went down, what's going on in the region, and where it's all coming from. So like, what would be like your elevator speech to address like either like what's going on in the Middle East as a whole, or like the Palestine-Israeli conflict specifically? Thank you.
First of all, thank you for reading Mornings in Janine. I love your shirt. I personally, and I'm not saying this is how everyone should live, I don't have an elevator spiel. Not anymore anyway. Mostly because I've lost patience, but I've also come to the realization there's something very humiliating about constantly trying to prove your humanity, to prove, to prove that you belong in this world, that you deserve your own heritage and history, that you deserve the right to live in homes that were constructed by your great-grandparents, and to visit the graves of your ancestors and so forth, that you have a right to visit your holy sites and so forth. So I don't really engage in those conversations anymore. I encourage people to read and to investigate. I mean, we live in an era where information is so easily accessible, and quite literally at our fingertips, whatever we want to know. So I don't feel it's my responsibility to try and educate people or to prove my humanity, certainly. I think we all have an obligation to, and a social responsibility to know about other peoples. As a Palestinian, actually, and this is one of my criticisms of other Palestinians, is that we tend to be very centered in our own victimhood. It's kind of like a narcissism of victimhood, I call it, that we sometimes don't see the tremendous and breathtaking suffering around the world. So I think it's important for individuals. I think it's the most important thing, actually, for individuals and socially to become informed about these things, and it's not difficult. Like I said, information is so easily accessible, and for those who don't like to read, there are a gazillion documentaries. But if you do want to have a spiel, if you feel like that's something you want to do, sometimes I would ask somebody, just give me a reason why you think it's okay that I, as a Palestinian with literally hundreds of years of documented family history, cannot live in my homeland, whereas my American Jewish neighbor, who has absolutely zero familial attachment to that land, can go there and live as she likes. I mean, that's the basic injustice of this. It's premised on supremacy. It's premised on entitlement, and all the ingredients of colonialism. Thanks.
My name's Chandler. I'll be starting a graduate program, International Affairs and Global Enterprise, in January. I have kind of a two-part question, I guess you could say. First of all, I just wanted to ask, in your opinion, is there ever a kind of junction that is reached when intervention from another nation can be justified at another nation? And also, how do you, like, kind of basing this off the assumption that humankind is somewhat selfish and based on their own self-interest, how do you view, like, I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of how to best form it.
Take your time, yeah.
How do you think that we can constructively have relations with other nations without being self-seeking, I guess, is kind of a way to form that. And secondly, I realize that this is not, this is the million-dollar question, but if you were elected the person that was put in charge of the Palestine, what would you do? Do you kick all the Israelis out immediately? I'm just asking because I've lived in that region. I've seen it. So this is something that is kind of near to my heart as well, although my lineage is not from there. I also think that we, as Americans, don't value ancestral land as much as others because none of us come from here originally. Obviously, with the way we treated the Native Americans, we don't value it as much.
That's not past tense, but
yeah,
continue
to treat them as well. Yeah. I guess my first question is just what socioeconomically, like how can we construct mutually beneficial relations with other nations without being economically self-interested? And secondly, what do you do if you're in charge of
Okay.
Palestine.
Got
So
it.
Sorry, that was
All right, no more.
not
I have two brain cells, and they can, one question.
That wasn't the
each.
best constructed question, but thank you.
No, thank you. Those are very good questions. So, I would ask you, how do you, as an individual, does your family or your family have constructive relationships with your neighbor? Do you feel like you have to go and steal their flower beds constantly? Do you, go out and take the glass panes out of their windows because you might need some? I think it works that way on a global scale and a national scale. The way we approach the rest of the world is with extreme arrogance, with contempt for other lives, for other histories, and other narratives. And I think, it's, to me, it's how you would conduct yourself on an individual level and on a community level. So I don't understand why it would even, to be honest, to be a question. How do you deal with other people without beating them on the head constantly? Stop beating them on the head. And I think you would find when you approach people with humility and with respect, I think you get that back. And that's how you have relationships with other nations and with other people. In the Middle East, for example, when nations were gaining their independence from the traditional colonial powers, people in the Middle East actually looked to the United States because the United States was not yet apparent as a colonial power. People in the Middle East saw Europeans like the UK and France as colonizers, but they looked to the United States as champions of freedom. So we had an opening there, and you can actually kind of see this in some of the romanticized films that involved the Middle East and that time. We weren't depicted as crazy, irrational terrorists just yet, but they were people who could have been our friends. That we could have had very strong economic ties with, very strong social ties with, and so forth. But it was the arrogance that we approached them with, and the sense of entitlement, the sense that they were too unworthy and too stupid to know what to do with their own resources and with their own history. And especially in Palestine and Syria and Iraq, there's this romantic aura of their history. It's the beginning of civilizations. It's the beginning of religions, monotheistic religions, anyway. And how we approached them was just with basic contempt, that they don't really deserve all that, So your other question, if I was queen of the world or queen of Palestine, would I kick all the Jews out? And again, I think that this is kind of one of those questions where I'm asked to prove my humanity and prove that I'm not a monster that's going to go and make refugees of people. I'm the daughter of refugees who's lived in exile her whole life, completely in a disassembled and dismantled family. It's not something I would ever want to inflict on others. I think that for Israelis who were born there, that's their country. That's the place they know. But it's also my country, and so if I was queen. And if I had the power, I would institute a constitution that afforded rights and privileges to citizens equally, regardless of religion and regardless of the various hierarchies that Israeli society has set for human worth. So that would be the first thing I'd do. And I would also allow for the repatriation, of course, of Palestinians and the recognition of our history. And it's from that point, when you level the playing field, when all things become equal, it's only from that point that reconciliation can begin. The notion that you start reconciliation and you start dialogue now when there's still a master-slave relationship is absurd. So I hope that answers your question.
Please join me in thanking our guest, Susan Abulhawa.
Thank you.